When you spend your life driving for a living, you get used to the quiet. You get used to the endless stretches of asphalt, the hum of the engine, and the way the world seems to shrink down to just the space illuminated by your headlights. Most nights on the road are completely uneventful, but every now and then, the darkness on the side of the road hides things that defy explanation. For one trucker, February 2nd started out like any other cold Monday. He had been working for a warehouse company in Kansas for 3 years, mostly driving a semi. Because it was the start of a busy week, many loads needed to go out quickly, and he wanted to get his run over with. He started his route at 3 in the afternoon, intending to push all the way to his destination before stopping. He did not want to pull off on the shoulder of some dark road to sleep, so he was highly motivated to keep moving. By midnight, he was running ahead of schedule, pushing the truck about 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. On a normal highway, that is fast for a semi. He was starting to feel the heavy weight of exhaustion. His eyes were burning and dry, and it was a struggle just to keep them open. To try and force himself awake, he splashed some cold water onto his hand and rubbed it over his face. It helped a little bit, but the road ahead was empty and pitch black. And then, as he reached to take a sip of water, his heart suddenly jumped into his throat. Far ahead in the distance, a figure appeared out of nowhere, standing right in the path of the truck. He slammed his foot onto the brakes, the heavy semi groaning as it slowed down to a crawl. In the bright glare of his headlights, he could finally make out the details of the person standing near the middle of the road. The figure was dressed entirely in black, with some kind of heavy black scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. But what made the driver freeze was the man's neck. It looked unnaturally long, stretching upward in a way that looked completely deformed and wrong. The face itself was a strange blur. The driver slowly rolled his window down, intending to ask if the man needed some help. But before he could speak, the figure suddenly spun around and sprinted directly into the thick woods on the side of the road. He did not wait around for an extra second to think about what he had just seen. He pressed his foot hard onto the gas pedal and kept moving. It actually took about 20 seconds for the sheer shock of the encounter to sink in, and that was when his heart started racing. 5 minutes later, he was finally starting to calm down when something else happened. As he cruised down the dark highway, another shape dashed across the road right in front of him. At first, he thought it was a large animal, but as it disappeared into the trees, he realized it was another person. This time, he did not even touch the brakes. He just pressed harder on the gas, desperately wanting to put as much distance between himself and that stretch of road as possible. But the adrenaline eventually faded, and the intense fatigue returned. He was starting to drift and swerve into the opposite lane. With 40 minutes left in his drive, he knew he could not safely make it. He began looking for a safe place to pull over. Eventually, he spotted a small gravel turnout on the side of the road, likely meant as a temporary resting spot. He pulled the semi-truck inside, shut off the engine, and immediately fell asleep. He slept for less than an hour before he suddenly snapped awake. The cabin was pitch black. He did not know what woke him, but a strong, undeniable gut feeling told him to turn on his headlights. He reached over and clicked the switch. The bright lights flooded the gravel area in front of the truck, and standing right there, directly in front of the bumper, was the man with the black scarf. This time, the driver could see his face clearly. The man had a wide, distorted smile, and his eyes were stretched open, staring directly through the windshield. Terrified, the driver started the engine, threw the truck into gear, and tore out of the gravel lot. He did not stop again until he reached his destination, where he fell asleep in the parking lot. He still wonders if his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him, but the memory of that wide, staring smile is something he will never forget. Our second story takes us to North Carolina back in the winter of 2010. A young man who had graduated from college 2 years prior was working as a UPS delivery driver. The pay was good, and he enjoyed the work, but the area he was assigned to was far from ideal. It was a small town where the neighborhoods were strange. Some blocks had trailer homes spaced far apart, while other blocks were completely desolate, bordered by dense woods. This made deliveries take much longer because of the sheer distance between each stop. It was a Thursday evening, and he was working the 11 to 7 shift. Because it was the dead of winter, darkness had already fallen by 5 o'clock. He He was wrapping up his route, heading down an isolated street with spaced-out trailer homes on one side and a dark forest on the other. He had one final package that required a signature. He pulled up in front of a dark trailer home, went to the back of his truck, and lifted out one of the heaviest boxes of the day. As he carried it, he could hear small metal pieces clanking and sliding around inside. He had no idea what was in the box, but his only job was to get it to the front door. The trailer home was completely dark. There were no lights on, and there was no car parked in the driveway. He walked up to the door and knocked loudly. Since there was no doorbell, there was no answer. He knocked again, and this time he saw a slight movement behind the window curtains. He heard footsteps approaching the door, but then everything went quiet. There was a long, incredibly tense pause. Finally, the door cracked open. An older woman poked her head out, looking incredibly nervous. When he explained that she had a package that required a signature, she opened the door the rest of the way and signed the device with a sloppy, rushed scrawl. Before he could hand over the heavy package, she looked at him and said that he needed to help her carry it into her back room. Because of how heavy it was, and because she was an elderly woman, he agreed. But the moment he stepped inside the trailer home, a horrific smell hit him. It was a thick, foul stench that made his stomach turn instantly. He could not identify what it was. The woman began leading him through the dark house, passing through a cramped living room and into a narrow, dark hallway. At the end of the hall, she opened a door and pointed toward a closet in the back corner of the bedroom. She told him to put the box inside. The room was pitch black. The driver asked her to turn on the light, but she quickly replied that the light did not work. The only illumination came from a dim lamp in the living room, casting long, eerie shadows down the hallway and into the bedroom. As he walked carefully toward the back of the room to place the box near the closet, he stopped dead in his tracks. Inside the dark closet, standing perfectly still in the shadows, was the silhouette of a person. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was a human being. He could see the distinct outline of their body, and he saw a slight, subtle shift in their posture as they waited in the dark. Instantly, his survival instincts flared. Without saying another word, he gently set the heavy box down right where he was standing, spun around, and walked quickly past the older woman. He hurried down the hallway toward the front door. As soon as he stepped outside, the woman began screaming at him at the top of her lungs, calling him horrible names and demanding that he get back inside. He ignored her, ran to his delivery truck, locked the doors, and drove away. He finished his shift in a state of sheer panic, and the very next day he began searching for a new job. To this day, he has no doubt that he narrowly escaped a trap that night. Our final story comes from an experienced truck driver who started his career when he was 25 years old. He had driven countless night routes across the country and had seen plenty of strange things, but nothing could prepare him for what happened on a remote highway in California. He had to deliver a trailer full of wooden furniture from one side of the state to the other. It was a massive drive, and because he got a late start, he knew that most of the journey would take place in total darkness. Most of the route took him through empty desert roads. These roads are famously long, incredibly straight, and almost completely barren of traffic, which allowed him to drive a bit faster than usual. As he drove through the empty desert night, he suddenly spotted the flashing hazard lights of a car in the distance. He had to apply the brakes hard to bring his truck to a stop. He pulled up behind the vehicle. It was an old Chevy Impala, parked on the dirt shoulder. He decided to check if they needed help. He walked over to the car, tapped on the window, but received no response. He leaned down and looked through the tinted windows, but the car was empty. He checked the other seats and confirmed there was absolutely no one inside. He stood there in the quiet desert, looking out into the pitch-black darkness. Feeling helpful, he went back to his truck and grabbed a heavy-duty tactical flashlight from the toolbox underneath his passenger seat. The light was incredibly bright. When he switched the flashlight on and swept the beam across the area, he noticed an old, abandoned gas station. The entire parking lot was made of dirt, and there were two rusted gas pumps sitting in front of a small, decaying convenience store. It seemed highly likely that whoever owned the abandoned Chevy Impala had walked over to that building. The front door of the store was permanently jammed open. The driver walked up to the entrance and shone his powerful flashlight inside. The beam lit up a large empty room that was once filled with shelves. The place had clearly been abandoned for years. He stepped inside and called out, letting anyone know that he was there to help. His voice echoed strangely off the empty walls. Then he heard a distinct sound. It was the faint scrape of a shoe sliding against the floor on the far side of the room, behind a row of empty shelves. He called out a second time, asking if anyone needed assistance. From the shadows, a deep, heavy whisper cut through the silence. The voice said, "Get out." The words were completely clear, but before he could even process why someone would say that, he heard a heavy, raspy breathing coming from the corner of the room. And then, a woman's terrified scream echoed from the back section of the building. The driver did not hesitate. He turned and ran as fast as he could back to his truck. He scrambled inside, locked the doors, and immediately dialed 911. He was breathing heavily, trying to explain the situation to the dispatcher. But because he was on an unmarked desert road, he could not give them an exact location. All he could tell them was that he was parked next to an abandoned gas station. The dispatcher urged him to stay on the line to help them pinpoint his location. But suddenly, the headlights of the Chevy Impala in front of him turned on. The engine roared to life, and the car sped away down the highway, disappearing into the dark. He had been so distracted by the emergency call that he had not even seen the driver get into the car. Realizing that someone inside the building might be in danger, and with the dispatcher still listening, the driver made the decision to run back inside. He rushed through the front door, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly, and made his way to the back section of the store. When he reached the back section where he had heard the whispering and screaming, his heart sank. The room was empty, but lying on the dusty concrete floor was a fresh, pooling puddle of blood. There was no body left behind. The driver stayed on the line with the police until state troopers finally arrived. He gave them every piece of information he could muster, explaining that the suspect had fled in a black Chevy Impala. He told them about the heavy whisper warning him to get out, and the terrifying scream of the woman right before the car sped away. Because he did not have a dash cam installed, he could not get the license plate number. The police collected blood samples and processed the crime scene. But the driver never heard if they ever found the victim or the person responsible. The sheer terror of that night stayed with him, and the very next week, he purchased and installed a high-definition dashcam in his truck. These stories serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the dark, quiet corners of our highways. Whether it is a strange figure standing in the middle of a lonely road, an unexpected intruder waiting in a dark closet, or a violent crime scene hidden in an abandoned desert gas station, the truth is that the night holds secrets we may never fully understand. The survivors of these encounters were left with lingering questions and a deep sense of dread that time can never truly erase. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Years ago, a well-known true crime researcher shared a video discussing some of the creepiest drawings ever made by children. Many of them seemed like typical childhood oddities, but a few stood out because they felt as though they had much darker, more sinister backstories. Drawings are often seen as just a way for children to express their wild imaginations, but sometimes they act as a literal window into an ongoing, real-life crime. Over the years, people from all over the world began sending in their own personal experiences, along with the drawings their siblings, children, or charges had made. Today we are going to dive into 3 of those stories. These are not just spooky tales, they are documented events where a simple piece of paper and crayon revealed a terrifying reality. Our first story takes us back to the summer of 2012. Tracy was 14 years old at the time, living in a quiet, friendly suburban neighborhood with her parents and her 6-year-old little brother. Like many teenagers during the summer break, Tracy was often tasked with helping out around the house, which included keeping an eye on her brother and occasionally tidying up his room. One afternoon, Tracy was doing just that. She was picking up toys, putting books back on the shelves, and organizing the general clutter. As she reached down to gather some stray items from under her brother's bed, her hand brushed against a piece of paper. She pulled it out, assuming it was just a discarded coloring page that she could throw in the recycling bin. But when she flipped it over, she stopped what she was doing. The paper was a drawing of their family. It was created with the typical skill level of a 6-year-old, using bright crayons to depict stick figures. At the center of the page was the family dinner table. Tracy could easily identify everyone. There was her mother, her father, Tracy herself, and her little brother. The boy had even gone out of his way to include highly detailed drawings of the family dog and the family cat sitting near the table. However, what caught Tracy's attention and made her skin crawl was a fifth person in the drawing. Sitting on the floor, tucked away in the corner directly behind the dinner table, was a figure dressed entirely in jet black clothing. The figure had reddish-brown, curly hair drawn with thick, deliberate crayon strokes. Every time Tracy looked at the dark figure, she felt as if those crudely drawn eyes were staring back at her, bringing an overwhelming sense of dread into the sunny bedroom. Tracy sat down on the edge of the bed and called her brother into the room. She held up the drawing and asked him who the man in black was. Her brother looked at the paper, but instead of answering, he shrugged his shoulders, looked down at his shoes, and said that he was not allowed to tell. Tracy tried to ask again, thinking it might be a game, but he refused to say another word. Feeling uneasy, Tracy decided to keep the drawing and show it to her parents that evening. When the family gathered for dinner, Tracy placed the drawing on the table and explained what her brother had said. The parents looked at it, and the father laughed it off. He figured the boy had just created an imaginary friend, or was playing a make-believe game. But when the mother gently asked the boy who the fifth person was, his entire demeanor changed. He crossed his arms, made a pouty face, and shrugged his shoulders. The only response they could get out of him was the exact same phrase, "I am not allowed to tell." No matter how much they nudged, he would not budge. But the problem was, things only got stranger from there. A few days later, the parents had to go out for a few hours, leaving Tracy in charge of watching her brother. As Tracy sat in the living room doing her homework, the house was mostly quiet. But then, she started to hear the faint sound of voices coming from her brother's bedroom down the hall. It sounded like a two-way conversation. Tracy stood up, crept down the carpeted hallway, and quietly pushed his bedroom door open. Her brother was sitting on the floor, pushing his toy cars back and forth. He appeared to be talking to himself. Tracy walked in and asked if he was talking to anyone, but he just shrugged and ignored her. But as Tracy looked around the room, she noticed something highly unusual. Lying on the carpet near his toys were several pieces of green apple-flavored hard candy. Tracy held them up to the light, noting they were a cheap, generic brand you could only get at specific dollar stores or gas stations, which was highly alarming because their mother was incredibly strict about sweets and never bought this specific type of candy. Tracy asked her brother where he got the candy, but he went completely silent. When Tracy reached down to pick them up, her brother suddenly flew into a rage. He screamed at her, demanding that she give them back immediately. When their parents returned home, Tracy handed them the candy and explained what had happened. Because it was the middle of the summer break, there was no way he could have gotten the candy from school or friends. The parents grew deeply concerned. They questioned the boy, but he stubbornly refused to speak. At this point, the father decided to ground him, telling him he had to stay in his room until he decided to tell the truth. To make sure no one was secretly entering the house, the parents searched every corner. They checked the closets, looked under the bed, and even searched the hallway storage spaces. They checked the basement stairs and the window locks, but they overlooked the fact that the little boy's window did not have a secure latch. That night, Tracy could not sleep. She had a terrible feeling that something was deeply wrong. Instead of lying in her bed, she dragged a pillow to the floor and sat right next to her bedroom door, which was directly adjacent to her brother's room. She knew that if her brother started talking again, she would easily hear it through the thin walls. Sure enough, way past her brother's bedtime, she heard the quiet sound of whispering. Tracy did not hesitate. She jumped up, ran down the hallway, and flung his bedroom door open. What she saw made her heart drop into her stomach. Her 6-year-old brother was standing right in front of his wide-open window. On the other side of the screen, a grown man was holding onto the window frame, preparing to climb directly into the room. Tracy let out a blood-curdling scream for her parents. The moment the man saw Tracy and heard her scream, He let go of the window frame, dropped to the ground, and fled into the dark night on a bicycle. Her brother burst into tears, terrified by the sudden chaos. The parents rushed in, and the police were called immediately. With officers in the house, the little boy finally realized the danger he was in and began to talk. He explained that his new friend had told him never to tell anyone about him, otherwise they would not be allowed to play anymore. He said they had met a few weeks earlier in front of the house. The man had stopped on his bicycle, offered him candy, and promised to bring more if they could hang out. The young boy, trusting the stranger, had pointed out his bedroom window and told him how to get there. It was a chilling realization of just how close the family had come to an absolute tragedy, all foreshadowed by a simple crayon drawing. And so, while that situation was resolved before anyone was hurt, it shows how easily a child's innocent drawing can hold a terrifying truth. But sometimes the threat is not outside the window, but right inside the room. It was the kind of fear that ruins a family's sense of safety, transforming their peaceful home into a place of constant vigilance. Fast forward to 2015, when a mother of 2 children, a 6-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, shared a deeply disturbing experience. For weeks, a bizarre and exhausting routine had taken over their household. Every single night, somewhere between midnight and 5 in the morning, the mother would wake up to the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. There, standing in the doorway, would be her 6-year-old son, crying and shaking with fear. The clock on her nightstand would read 3 in the morning, and the cold draft from the air conditioning made the quiet house feel even more ominous. The mother would lie awake for hours after putting him back to sleep, listening to every creak and groan of the old house, wondering if she was losing her mind. He claimed that every night, a terrifying figure would emerge from his bedroom closet. It would slowly walk across the room and stop at the exact same spot at the foot of his bed, where it would just stand and stare at him in the darkness. In the beginning, the parents did what any normal parents would do. They walked him back to his room, turned on the lights, and searched the closet to prove to him that nothing was there. But there was one detail that kept bothering them. Every time they went into his room, the closet door was wide open, even though they always made sure to shut it tightly before he went to sleep. When they asked the boy why the closet door was open, he cried and said it was because the thing had opened it to come out. Meanwhile, his 8-year-old sister slept soundly in the next room, completely oblivious. In the summer of 1991, a 12-year-old boy named Jared Negretti was incredibly excited to go on a camping trip. He was a member of a local Boy Scout troop, and this trip was supposed to be a fun, challenging adventure. The troop, which consisted of 14 other boys and their scoutmaster, was heading out to hike towards the summit of Mount San Gorgonio. This mountain is located in the San Bernardino National Forest in Southern California. Jared was on the shorter and heavier side, which made hiking up a steep mountain much harder for him, but he was determined to keep up and have a great time with his friends. As the day went on and the group climbed higher, the physical toll started to show. Around 6 p.m., the group was about 1,000 feet away from the summit. At this point, another group of hikers who were on their way down the mountain spotted Jared. He was straggling behind his troop, clearly struggling with the pace. The hikers noticed that Jared was trying to take shortcuts across the switchbacks on the trail to catch up. They immediately told him not to do that and warned him to stay on the main trail for his own safety. These hikers then continued on and notified the scoutmaster, who was already up at the summit, that one of his boys was lagging behind. The scoutmaster was an experienced hiker and knew the area well. He told the hikers that he would pick up Jared on his way down. It seemed like a straightforward plan, but the problem was, when the scoutmaster finally began his descent and went to look for Jared, the boy was nowhere to be seen. He had completely vanished. As soon as the scoutmaster realized that Jared was gone, panic set in, but he had to make a difficult decision. He could not leave the other 14 scouts stranded on the mountain in the dark. So, he gathered the remaining boys and quickly guided them back to the base camp. Once they were safe, the scoutmaster hiked about 5 miles in the pitch black of night to get help. Soon, sheriff's deputies and search and rescue teams were mobilized. They began a massive search operation covering a 130 square mile area of the San Gorgonio wilderness. This area is extremely difficult to navigate, with very rocky terrain and a dense tree line. Within 3 days, searchers managed to focus their efforts on a 6-square-mile area. In this zone, they made some promising discoveries. They found a footprint in the dirt that they believed matched one of Jared's high-top tennis shoes. Nearby, they also found beef jerky and candy wrappers, which they believed Jared had dropped as he walked. And perhaps most importantly, they found his camera. When investigators developed the film roll inside, they found 12 pictures. Most of them were simple landscape photos that Jared had taken when he was still hiking with his troop. But the very last picture on the roll was incredibly haunting. It was a self-portrait. It appeared that Jared had pointed the camera at his own face, using the flash to illuminate himself. Investigators believed he might have lost the camera when he slid down a portion of the steep mountainside. The search grew even larger. At least 70 officers were deployed, with some being airlifted by helicopters and others searching on horseback. Some of the helicopters were equipped with specialized infrared scanning technology to detect body heat. Over the next 2 weeks, the scale of the search became massive. As many as 3,000 people volunteered, logging 45,000 hours of search time. They combed through 50 square miles of the San Bernardino National Forest. But despite all of this, they found nothing else. This raises the question of what actually happened to him. Did he simply fall off the trail and slip down the mountain slide? While that is possible, it seems highly unlikely that his body would not have been found in the immediate area around the switchbacks he was cutting down. Some people wondered if he might have been the victim of a wild bear attack, but searchers found absolutely no signs of blood, no drag marks, and no other evidence that would point to an animal attack. Others believe he might have been abducted by a predator, especially since the mountain is heavily used by other hikers. To this day, over 3 decades later, Jared's remains have never been found, and his disappearance remains a profound mystery. On the cold night of February 24, 1978, 5 young men from Yuba County, California, set out for what should have been a fun, simple road trip. Their names were Bill Sterling, Jack Hez, Ted Weir, Jack Madruga, and Gary Mattis. They were heading to California State University in Chico to watch a basketball game. All 5 of these men suffered from mild mental issues, but they were still fully capable of functioning in society. They were very close friends and did almost everything together. In fact, they were scheduled to play in a Special Olympics basketball game of their own the very next day. They were so excited that they had already laid out their uniforms before leaving for the college game. And then, when the night ended and the next day arrived, the men did not return. Their friends and family quickly grew incredibly concerned. What was supposed to be a quick trip to watch a game turned into a chilling mystery. A police search was launched shortly after they were reported missing. A few days later, searchers made their first major breakthrough, but it only brought more questions. The men's car, a Mercury Montego, was found abandoned in a very strange location. It was far from the route they should have taken to get back to Yuba City. In fact, it was about an hour in the wrong direction, driven up a winding mountain pass in the Plumas National Forest at the northern point of the Sierra Nevada. When police inspected the vehicle, they found a few empty food wrappers and drink bottles inside. Other than that, the car was completely empty. Curiously, the car was in perfect working condition. It was lodged in a snowbank, but there were no signs of foul play. But the car could have been easily pushed out of the snow by the 5 young men. For the next week, police and forest rangers searched the snowy wilderness, hoping to find any sign of the group. Unfortunately, a massive winter storm rolled in, dumping feet of snow and covering any potential tracks or clues. As the search stalled, police received a few reported sightings. First, a man named Joseph Scahn called the police with a strange story. He said he saw them on the Friday they disappeared, while trying to push his own stuck car out of the snow. While doing so, Joseph suffered a mild heart attack. As he lay in his car, he saw flashlight beams outside and a small group of people. He cried out to them for help, but they suddenly turned off their lights and disappeared into the dark, completely ignoring him. Another witness, a local store owner, claimed she saw 5 men in a red pickup truck on Saturday and Sunday, about an hour away from where the abandoned car was found. She told police that 2 of the men came into her store to buy food and use the phone, while the others stayed in the truck. But these leads led nowhere. The mystery deepened significantly months later, in June of that year, when the snow finally melted. A local man was walking in the forest and noticed a broken window on a Forest Service trailer. This trailer was located about 19.5 miles away from where the car had been abandoned. When police went inside to inspect it, they made a gruesome discovery. They found the body of Ted Weir lying on a bed. He was wrapped in many layers of blankets, and his feet were badly frostbitten. Forensic analysis revealed that he had died of starvation, which made absolutely no sense, because there was a massive supply of non-perishable food readily available in the trailer that had not been opened. Even more bizarre was the fireplace. There was plenty of wood and matches, and he could have easily started a fire to keep warm, but the fireplace was completely untouched. There were also warm snow clothes inside the trailer that Ted had never used. Forensics estimated that Ted might have survived in that trailer for up to 13 weeks after the initial disappearance. Outside the trailer, the search became even more tragic. The bones of Bill Sterling, Jack Hoots, and Jack Madruga were found scattered in the woods not far from Ted's body. They had all died of hypothermia. But strangely, Gary Mattis was never found. Only his shoes were discovered in the nearby woods. To this day, no one can explain why the group drove up that mountain, why they abandoned a working car they could have easily pushed out of the snow, why they ignored Joseph Scon's cries for help, or why Ted Weir starved and froze to death in a trailer fully stocked with food and heating supplies. Fast forward to June of 2004, to a town called Scotia, New York. A 17-year-old boy named Craig Fryer was living a life that many would envy. He was a popular kid, described as having dimples, red hair, and a welcoming smile. He was a star soccer player at Scotia Glenville High School, and he was just about to be named the captain of his team. On top of that, several colleges were already showing interest in offering him athletic scholarships. He had recently taken a part-time job, and his future was looking incredibly bright. But all of that promise vanished on June 27, 2004, when Craig walked into the woods and was never seen again. To understand what happened, we have to look back at the weeks leading up to his disappearance. When Craig got a job at the Price Chopper supermarket in Glenville, his parents were very proud of him for managing his time so well between school, sports, and work. On the day he disappeared, his parents saw him walk out of the house. He was carrying his uniform, and his mother, Veronica, thought he was going to work. Later that afternoon, Veronica went to shop at the supermarket where Craig worked, but she could find no trace of him. When she asked the manager, she was shocked to learn that Craig was not on the schedule. In fact, he had been fired from his job 2 months earlier. He had been pretending to work there for weeks after his termination so that his parents would not know. Deeply upset, Veronica tried to reach him, but Craig had left his cell phone and wallet at home. She then called his girlfriend, who, unbeknownst to the parents, was actually his ex-girlfriend. At first, the girl claimed she had no idea where Craig was. But during a second call, filled with guilt, she admitted that Craig was actually right there with her. Veronica asked to speak to her son and lectured him over the phone, telling him he needed to come home immediately so they could talk about his lies. Craig was already highly emotional because of his recent breakup, and this phone call only added to his distress. He told his mother he would be home in 10 minutes, the time it would take to drive from his ex-girlfriend's place to home. He said goodbye to his ex-girlfriend and walked out. She watched him from her window as he walked toward his car, but then she saw him stop. He stood perfectly still for a moment, and then suddenly, he darted off in the opposite direction. It looked as if something had terrified him, and he was running away from imminent danger. Around this exact time, Craig's father arrived at the apartment complex to pick him up, but he only found Craig's car still parked in the lot. By 5 p.m., Veronica reported him missing. At first, the police were not too interested, assuming he was just a normal kid running away because of an argument. But as days passed without a word, and knowing he had no money or phone, they realized something was very wrong. They eventually got a lead when some local teenagers came forward. They told police they had seen a boy matching Craig's description walking along the railroad tracks behind the apartment complex. They claimed that when they called out to him, Craig turned, put his finger to his lips to motion for them to be quiet, and then silently disappeared into the woods. Massive searches of the railway lines, The woods and the nearby Mohawk River were conducted with dogs, but they found absolutely nothing. For nearly 2 decades, the case went cold. But in 2021, a new lead emerged. A former co-worker of Craig's from the supermarket told investigators that sometime between June 27th and June 2nd, 2004, he saw Craig sitting in the passenger seat of a car. The car was traveling north on Route 50 in Glenville. The witness said the car stopped at a red light on Sheffield Road, then turned left and drove away. To this day, Craig's family is still searching for answers, wondering what could have made a young man with such a bright future run away into the woods and disappear forever. Finally, we have a case that is widely considered to be one of the most chilling and baffling disappearances in the history of national parks. In March of 2014, 2 young women from the Netherlands, Chris Kmers and Leanne Froon, traveled to Panama. They had spent the previous month working extra shifts at their jobs to save up enough money for this trip. After arriving in Panama, they eventually made their way to the small mountain town of Boquete, which is spelled Boca in local records. They were hosted by a family. On April 1st, 2014, Chris and Leanne decided to go for a hike on the scenic trails in the forest surrounding the town. This hike was unusual because they had a guide named Feliciano scheduled for the next day. For some reason, they decided to head out on their own a day early. They were accompanied on their walk by the host family's dog named Blue. Later that evening, Blue returned to the host family's house alone. The girls were nowhere to be found. The host family became worried and tried to contact Leanne's mother, who tried to call her daughter, but there was no response. The next morning, Feliciano arrived to meet the girls, but they never showed up. When he went to their host family's house, he discovered they had not slept in their beds, and almost all of their belongings were still in their room. They had taken their cell phones with them, but any calls to their numbers went straight to voicemail. A massive search was quickly organized, involving local farmers, search dogs, detectives, and helicopters. They searched the dense jungle for 10 days but found absolutely nothing. 2 months later, a local resident found a backpack near a riverbank. Inside the backpack was a camera and their cell phones. Not far from where the pack was found, searchers also discovered skeletal remains. DNA testing confirmed that these bones belonged to Chris and Leanne. When investigators analyzed the cell phone logs, they made a deeply disturbing discovery. Over the course of 10 days, the girls had repeatedly tried to dial 911, but they never had enough cell signal for the calls to go through. Inside the backpack, the camera contained 100 photos. The first 10 photos were normal vacation pictures, showing the girls smiling on the trail. But the remaining 90 photos were taken in pitch darkness between the hours of 1 and 4 in the morning. Some believe they were using the camera flash as a light source to see in the dark. One of these photos was a close-up of the back of Chris's head, showing what looked like a wound to her right temple, with blood in her hair. It is possible Leanne was using the flash to check her friend's injury. Or, more chillingly, some believe that someone else took those photos. Strangely, a hiking boot was found with a foot still inside, which was matched to Chris. Also found was a pelvic bone that belonged to Leanne. The official police theory is that they got lost. One of them fell and got hurt, and the other died trying to save her. But many people suspect foul play, pointing to the tour guide, Feliciano. Several other women have left reviews warning people about him, claiming he was overly aggressive, and had even joked about chopping off a girl's leg. Feliciano was also the one who found the shoe with the foot inside, located behind a very specific tree trunk, leading some to believe he knew exactly where to look. Whether it was a tragic accident or a sinister crime, the truth of what happened to Chris and Leanne remains a mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2017, a young couple stood at the altar of the Church of the Little Flower in Coral Gables, Florida. It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. They invited all of their close friends and family, including the relatives that neither of them really liked. One of those guests was the bride's estranged aunt, Chelsea. Chelsea had a history of severe substance abuse problems that had led to a deep rift between her and the rest of the family. To everyone's surprise, Chelsea actually showed up, and she brought a date. But right from the moment the groom saw him, he knew something was very wrong. This guy did not look like the kind of person you would ever want to bring home to meet your family. His name was Rob, and his presence immediately set off alarm bells. After the ceremony, the wedding party moved outside. The bridesmaids, the groomsmen, and the newlyweds went to a scenic backyard section of the church campus to take photos. Chelsea and Rob came along to watch. Almost immediately, they started making everyone incredibly uncomfortable. While the bridal party was laughing and joking around naturally, Rob and Chelsea would suddenly shout out bizarre, highly inappropriate comments. They did it repeatedly, creating these painful, awkward silences. The entire bridal party was internally cringing, wishing they would just leave the venue entirely. But they stayed eventually. Everyone migrated over to Comber Hall, the reception venue. Food and drinks were being served, and the celebration was in full swing. As the groom, you barely have a moment to sit down or even eat. People are constantly walking up to you to offer congratulations. At one point, Rob approached the groom and shook his hand. Up close, his breath was terrible, and his arms were covered in scars. He was wearing a dirty, stained gray polo shirt and looked completely unkempt. He spoke in a loud, aggressive, almost demeaning tone. The groom did his best to remain polite, and after a few uncomfortable minutes, Rob finally walked back toward Chelsea. That was the last time the groom saw him that day. A little while later, the groom noticed Chelsea sitting all by herself. She had no idea where Rob had gone. She had not seen him in over an hour. Chelsea then explained that they had actually met in rehab and had only gone out on 4 dates. Hearing this made the couple incredibly nervous. They asked their family to quietly look around for Rob. A few minutes later, a relative brought back troubling news. They had checked the secure room where all the wedding gifts were being stored, and several of the gift boxes and cash envelopes were completely missing. The family immediately connected the missing gifts to Rob's sudden disappearance. They had an employee make an announcement over the microphone, asking everyone to keep an eye out for him. Chelsea tried to call Rob's phone, but when she checked her purse, she realized her own phone was missing too. After the reception, a few close friends went back to the couple's hotel room for an after-party. While they were hanging out, Chelsea sent a text message to Ally's phone from a different number. She asked Ally for their home address, explaining that she needed to drop off a wedding gift she had forgotten. Ally quickly texted back their home address, but just a few minutes later, they received a highly distressing phone call from Chelsea's actual phone number. Thinking Chelsea had found her phone, Ally put the call on speaker. But there was no voice on the other end. Instead, all they could hear was the heavy, slow, deliberate breathing of a man. It sounded exactly like a scene from a horror movie. Ally kept demanding to know where Chelsea was, but the caller remained completely silent, just breathing heavily into the receiver before hanging up. Worried, Ally called her grandmother, who confirmed that Chelsea was actually safe and sound, staying at her house for the night. Chelsea got on the phone and explained that she had definitely lost her phone at the wedding and did not know her Apple ID to track it. At this point, the horrifying reality set in. Rob was the one who had Chelsea's phone, and because Ally had just texted their home address, Rob now knew exactly where they lived. The couple was far too intoxicated to drive home, so they called the groom's father, who agreed to drive over to their house and spend the night there to keep watch. The next morning, the groom woke up to a barrage of missed calls and urgent texts from his father. The texts explained that throughout the night, someone had been repeatedly hopping onto the different windowsills of the house, tapping on the glass and trying to mess with him. The father had called the police, but by the time they arrived, the prowler had vanished. Later that day, the couple went to the police station to report Rob, but the police delivered frustrating news. Because there were no surveillance cameras inside Comber Hall to catch the theft on tape, and because Chelsea's phone had been turned off or destroyed, there was absolutely nothing they could do. There was no physical evidence linking Rob to the crimes. Chelsea later revealed that she and Rob had gotten into a major verbal argument before he disappeared. Rob had blamed the family, claiming they did not like him and had actively sabotaged him. This only solidified their belief that Rob had targeted them out of pure spite. Thankfully, they never saw or heard from Rob again after that terrifying experience, The newlyweds slowly began to rebuild their sense of security. They moved past the trauma of the wedding theft and the disturbing prowler, hoping that they had seen the absolute worst of what could happen during a wedding season. But as time went on, they would realize that sometimes the most deceptive threats do not come from strangers or estranged family members. Sometimes they come from those pretend to be close friends, hiding their true intentions behind thoughtful smiles. This brings us to a second case, which involved a young man who had a relatively low-key, beautiful wedding right on the beach. It was a small, intimate gathering of about 75 guests, mostly consisting of close family members and lifelong friends. The groom's wife, whom we will call Trisha, had invited her ex-boyfriend, Kyle. The groom did not really know how to feel about this, but he wanted to be accepting and supportive, because Trisha assured him that she and Kyle were now strictly platonic, close friends who shared a mutual friend group. They had dated for 3 years during college, but they had broken up amicably and there were absolutely no romantic feelings left. The groom trusted Trisha completely, so he agreed to let Kyle attend, wanting to be mature and secure. On the day of the wedding, Kyle was polite, but as the reception went on, the groom started to notice some highly unsettling behavior. Throughout the entire evening, Kyle was constantly trying to talk to Trisha, and whenever he was not actively speaking to her, he was staring intently in her general direction from across the room. The groom tried his best to brush it off, telling himself that it was just being a bit paranoid. After all, Trisha and he were officially married now, so Kyle had no realistic shot. Still, Kyle's behavior was slightly annoying and put a minor damper on the evening. The groom also noted that Kyle had come to the wedding completely alone, without a date, which seemed a little strange. The night ended beautifully, and the newlyweds spent a romantic evening at a waterfront hotel before returning to their new home the following day. When they got home, a few friends stopped by to congratulate them. Surprisingly, Kyle also decided to stop by completely unannounced. Kyle claimed he was just stopping by to check out their new place and to personally hand-deliver the wedding gift that he had forgotten to bring to the beach ceremony. He handed Trisha a paper envelope and a small, foot-long teddy bear holding a plush red heart. Stitched onto that heart were the couple's initials. At the time, the groom actually thought this was a very sweet, thoughtful, and creative gift. They politely gave Kyle a full tour of their new home, showing him the kitchen, the living room, and the bedrooms. Afterward, they offered him a beer, which he drank while chatting casually. After finishing his drink, Kyle said he had better get going, congratulated them once more, and left. Inside, the envelope was a card containing $100. Despite the nice gifts, the groom still believed Kyle had serious feelings for Trisha. He asked her to ease back on the friendship a bit, but Trisha could not see what her husband saw. She swore they were just very close friends, and that there were no feelings left. Trisha put the teddy bear next to some of the other gifts on their bedroom dresser. While the couple was in bed together having a romantic moment, the groom stopped when he heard a weird noise. It sounded like a small electrical component vibration. He checked his phone but assumed it was just a normal text notification. About half an hour later, laying in bed with the lights off, the groom brought up Kyle again. Trisha got a little annoyed but promised she would ease back on her contact with him, and they went to sleep. The next day, when the groom got home from work, Trisha explained that Kyle had randomly blocked her on Instagram. When she texted him asking what was wrong, he replied with a cold message. "What do you care? I heard the things you said." When she tried to text back, she saw that he had blocked her number too. They checked her phone's call history, but Kyle's name was not there. The groom wondered if she had pocket-dialed him, but there was no record. That night while in bed, they talked about it some more. Then, the groom heard the little electronic vibrating sound again. He looked at the teddy bear on the dresser, got up to pick it up, and his heart dropped. He grabbed a sharp knife from the kitchen and started to tear the bear open. Trisha realized it immediately too. Inside the bear's head was a square electrical component wired to a camera behind the left eye and a microphone box wired to the left ear. This was connected to a Bluetooth device that allowed a phone to send and receive data. Kyle had been using the teddy bear to spy on them in their bedroom, listening to their private conversations. They went to the police that night and filed a report. They hired a lawyer and pressed charges against Kyle for invasion of privacy. The judge ruled in their favor, requiring Kyle to pay $15,000 to each of them. Trisha also got a restraining order against him, ending his presence in their lives. While we hope that our close friends and invited guests would never violate our privacy in such a horrific way, sometimes the ultimate nightmare does not come from anyone we know at all. In some cases, the most terrifying encounters happen in the safety of our own homes, completely unprovoked, involving strangers who are suffering from deep, unsettling delusions. This brings us to our final story, which occurred in a small, peaceful suburban town where crime was virtually non-existent. The narrator of this story lived on a quiet, dead-end street and routinely left his front door unlocked. Returning home after a grueling 12-hour shift, his phone rang, but the caller immediately hung up. Exhausted, he cooked a simple dinner, took a hot shower, and fell asleep in bed watching television. Hours later, he jolted awake and turned off the TV, plunging the bedroom into pitch-black, absolute silence. In that sudden quiet, his ears picked up the sound of creaking floorboards. He stared into the darkness and vaguely made out a wide, tall silhouette standing near the foot of his bed. Panicking, he turned the television back on to light up the room, desperately trying to see. The cold blue glow of the screen revealed a sight that made his blood run cold. Standing there was a large woman dressed in a full white wedding dress and veil. She began whispering a single question over and over, growing louder. "Where is my groom?" Her whisper quickly turned into a hysterical scream as she grabbed the edge of his mattress and began violently shaking his entire bed with a manic, terrifying strength. Terrified, the narrator screamed at her to leave, pushed her away, and ran to the bathroom across the hall, locking the door. The woman followed him, banging on the door and crying that she had to get to her wedding. After a few terrifying minutes, she stomped downstairs and slammed the front door shut as she fled. The narrator called the police, who searched the dark area with flashlights but found no trace of her in the surrounding woods. They believed she was experiencing a severe psychological crisis and had wandered away from her family. It was a terrifying reminder that even in the safest neighborhoods, you are never truly secure unless you make it a daily habit to lock your doors and windows. This incident completely changed how he felt about his personal safety in his own home. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine living completely by yourself in a small rental house on the edge of town. It was a simple, one-story place located at the end of a quiet, dead-end road. On this entire street, there were only 5 houses, and because of this, night times were incredibly quiet. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, so my daily routine was pretty repetitive. I rarely left the house unless I absolutely had to grab groceries or run a quick errand. Visitors were a rare sight for me. My friends always knew to text me before they decided to drop by, so I never really expected anyone to just show up. That is why the first knock on my door stood out so much. It was about 8:45 on a Thursday night. I was sitting comfortably in my living room watching some television when suddenly I heard 4 very firm, deliberate knocks on my front door. I paused for a second, muted the television, and waited. At first, I thought maybe I had just imagined the sound, but then 2 more sharp knocks followed. I stood up and walked slowly toward the front door. Right in the center of the door, there was a small peephole. I stepped up to it and looked through. On my front porch stood a man holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He was wearing a dark jacket and a simple baseball cap. To be honest, he looked completely normal, maybe in his mid-30s. I opened the door, but kept the security chain firmly attached. The moment the door opened slightly, the man immediately spoke up. He told me he had a delivery that required a signature. He then looked down at a small handheld electronic device and read a name out loud. The problem was, it was not my name at all. It was not even close. I looked at him and said that he had the wrong address. He looked down at the box, then back at his device, and then directly at me. He read the address out loud, and this time, it was my exact address, word for word. I shook my head and told him that absolutely nobody by that name lived at this address. The man just stood there and stared at me for a second or two longer than was necessary. It felt incredibly awkward. Finally, he said that he must have been given the wrong information, and that he would take the package back to his truck. I watched through the window as he walked back down my driveway. I expected to see a delivery van or some kind of car parked nearby, but there was absolutely nothing. He just walked past my mailbox and turned the corner at the end of the road. I could not see where he went after that. I shut the door, locked it, and went back inside. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a delivery driver working for a small company, or maybe a contractor using their own unmarked vehicle. It seemed like a logical explanation, so I tried to let it go. But the very next night, at almost the exact same time, around 8:45, the knocks came again. This time, there were 3 of them. I felt a sudden spike of anxiety. I did not open the door this time. Instead, I went straight to the peephole to see who was outside. It was the exact same man, wearing the same dark jacket, and holding the exact same cardboard box. I refused to open the door. I just spoke loudly through the wood, telling him that he had already come by the night before, and that nobody by that name lived here. There was a long, heavy silence. Then the man spoke up, saying that he really just needed a signature, and that his system showed the package absolutely had to be delivered tonight. I told him firmly that I was not going to sign for a package meant for someone I did not know. Another long pause followed. Then, he simply said okay, and took a step back from the door. I kept my eye pressed against the peephole. Instead of turning around and walking away immediately, he just stood at the edge of my porch, looking around. He slowly turned his head toward my front windows, then toward the dark side of the house, and then looked right back at the front door. After about 15 seconds of this, he finally walked down the driveway. Once again, there was no vehicle anywhere in sight. That was the moment when everything started to feel deeply wrong. On the 3rd night, there were no knocks. I actually felt an immense wave of relief wash over me. I thought that maybe he had finally figured out his mistake and moved on. I even made a little joke to myself about how bizarre it would have been if he actually showed up for a 3rd time. But on the 4th night, that relief completely vanished. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening, and I was in the kitchen washing dishes. Suddenly, I heard 4 knocks, but the problem was they did not come from the front door. They came from the side of the house, right against my dining room window. I froze, holding a wet plate in my hands. I slowly walked into the dining room and stared at the window, but I could not see anyone through the glass. Then, almost instantly, 4 more heavy knocks echoed from the front door. My heart began to pound. I hurried over to the peephole and looked through. It was him again, but this time something was different. He was not holding a box anymore. His hands were completely empty. I stayed absolutely silent, hoping he would think nobody was home. He knocked again, harder this time. Then he stepped back and stared directly at the peephole, almost as if he knew I was standing right there looking at him. I quickly backed away from the door, making sure not to make a single sound or cause any movement that might show through the lens. After about 30 seconds, he finally turned around and walked away. I waited for 5 full minutes, letting the silence stretch out, before I dared to check the windows. I walked through the house with all the lights turned off, carefully parting the blinds just a fraction of an inch to look outside. And that was when I saw him. He was standing directly across the street, right near the tree line. He was completely motionless, just standing there in the dark, facing my house. After about a minute of watching him, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the woods. I went around the entire house and relocked every single window and door, even though I knew they were already locked. The very next day, I decided I had enough. I called the local police non-emergency line and explained the entire situation to the officer on duty. The officer listened carefully and told me that this sounded like a classic case of someone trying to verify occupancy. He explained that burglars will often knock on doors to see if anyone answers before they attempt to break in later on. He advised me to install some security cameras if I could, and told me to call 911 immediately if the man returned. That night, I decided to play it safe. I left all the front lights of the house completely off and stayed in my bedroom at the back. Right on cue, around 8:45, I heard those 4 familiar knocks at the front door. I stayed completely still and did not respond. A few seconds later, there were 4 more knocks, followed by a heavy silence. I waited in the dark, holding my breath. A minute went by, and then I heard a brand new sound. It was a soft, dull thud against the back of the house, followed by another one. I suddenly realized what was happening. Someone was testing my back door. I grabbed my phone, slipped out of bed, and quietly walked into the hallway. From there, I could clearly hear the metal doorknob of the back door slowly turning. It would turn, stop, and then turn again. I immediately dialed 911, keeping my voice down to a terrified whisper, and told the dispatcher that someone was actively trying to break into my house. While I was on the phone, the knocking suddenly started up again at the front door. The dispatcher assured me that officers were already on their way to my location, but the back doorknob just kept turning, and then I heard a light, metallic scraping sound against the door frame. It sounded like someone was trying to jam a tool into the lock. It became clear to me that there was more than one person out there. After about 30 agonizing seconds, all the noises suddenly stopped. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher in absolute silence until I finally saw the flashing blue lights of the police cars reflecting through my windows. When the officers searched the exterior of the house, they found fresh pry marks on the back door right next to the handle. One of the officers told me straight out that if I had not been home to secure the house and call them, the door would have likely been forced wide open. They searched the surrounding neighborhood, but could not find anyone suspicious that night. The next evening, I decided I could not stay there anymore. I packed a small bag and went to stay at my brother's apartment on the other side of town. I made sure not to post anything about my whereabouts on social media. I just left. Around 9 o'clock that night, my phone started ringing. It was my neighbor who lived 2 houses down. She asked me if I was home because she could see someone standing on my front porch, knocking repeatedly. She said he had been standing there for at least 5 minutes. I told her I was not home and asked if he had a car parked nearby. She said she did not see any vehicle at all. I asked her to call the police right away. When the officers arrived, they found the man still on my porch and began questioning him. Later that night, an officer called me to give me an update. He said the man claimed he was simply trying to deliver a package but had somehow misplaced it. However, he did not have any company identification, no delivery uniform, and no marked vehicle. The police gave him a strong warning to stay away from the property and let him go. But the story did not end there. Just 2 days later, the police arrested the exact same man in a nearby neighborhood. He had been caught red-handed attempting to break into a house whose owners were away on vacation. When the police searched his car, they found several empty cardboard boxes and a small handheld scanner that was completely fake and not connected to any real delivery company. During his interrogation, he finally admitted to his entire method. He confessed that he would knock on doors holding a fake package as a test. If someone answered, he would pretend it was a mistaken delivery, leave, and mark the house as occupied. But if nobody answered after multiple attempts, he would return later that night to force his way inside. He even told the detectives that he would sometimes knock several nights in a row just to study the patterns of the residents. If he saw lights on one night and completely dark the next, he would assume the residents were out and that the house was safe to rob. Hearing those words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I realized just how incredibly close I had come to disaster during that first week. If I had decided to ignore the door on those early nights, he probably would have broken in while I was asleep or away. 3 months later, as soon as my lease was up, I packed my things and moved out of that house. To this day, I still refuse to answer the door at night unless I know exactly who is coming. If I hear an unexpected knock, I stay completely quiet and check my security cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up on my porch with a package that has my address but not my name, I do not even think about going near the door. Now, let us move on to another story that took place during a time of year that is supposed to be filled with joy and family warmth, but instead turned into an absolute nightmare. This event began in the cold winter days leading up to Christmas in a town near Glasgow, Scotland. At the time, I was 16 years old, just about to turn 17. I lived in a lovely home with my parents, my siblings, and our family dogs and cats. We were a very close family, and we loved spending our winter evenings together in the living room, watching movies, playing games, and just catching up on each other's lives. It was one of those cozy nights when we were all gathered around the television watching A Christmas Carol. This was a classic tradition for us, and I always looked forward to it. But right in the middle of the movie, we heard a sudden knock at the front door. Since it was the holiday season, we did not think much of it, assuming it might be a neighbor or a delivery. My mom got up from her chair and went to answer it, but when she opened the door, the front porch was completely empty. There was nobody there. Our garden wrapped all the way from the front of the house to the back, so she checked the side paths, but she found absolutely nothing. She came back inside, slightly confused, and we went back to watching our movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the living room table, focusing hard on some exam preparation work. The house was quiet when suddenly I heard that same knock at the front door. I put my pen down, got up, and went to open it. Once again, there was absolutely nobody there. The street was completely still. At that point, we all assumed it must be some local neighborhood kids playing a prank. In Scotland, there is a very common game that kids play called Chappie. The rules are simple. Kids run up to a house, knock as hard as they can, and then run away laughing to hide. It is a silly game, but for kids, the quick rush of adrenaline from seeing an adult open an empty door is strangely exciting. We had a family group chat where we would keep each other updated, and over the course of that week, several other family members posted that they had experienced the exact same random knocks. But the one incident that really started to worry us happened to my dad. My dad was a bit of a night owl back then. He would usually stay up much later than the rest of the house, either playing video games on his Xbox or watching television once everyone else had gone to sleep. One night around 11:30, when the entire street was completely silent and all the neighborhood kids were definitely inside their homes, my dad heard a very quiet, gentle knock on the door. He was immediately confused because of how late it was. He walked over to the door and looked through the peephole first, but he did not see anyone. He slowly unlocked the door and opened it to look out into the night. The street was totally empty and silent. He locked the door back up, came upstairs, and asked if any of us had heard the noise. But because the knock had been so incredibly quiet, the rest of us had been fast asleep and heard nothing. This was the moment when a strange feeling of unease began to settle over the household. It was happening too often, and yet nobody had ever seen or heard anyone running away. Usually, when kids play Chappie, you can hear them whispering, giggling, or running down the pavement. But with these knocks, there was only ever dead silence. It felt like someone was standing there, knocking, and then just vanishing into thin air. When Christmas Day finally arrived, we tried to put the weird occurrences out of our minds. We spent the entire day opening presents, sharing gifts, playing family games, and eating far too much food. It was a wonderful, happy day. But later that night, all that rich holiday food started to catch up with me, and I began to feel really sick to my stomach. I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom to lie down for a bit. I ended up falling asleep and woke up much later. I reached over to check my phone, and the screen read 2:01 in the morning. The entire house was pitch black and completely silent. Everyone else had gone to bed hours ago. I knew right away that I would not be able to fall back asleep, because once I wake up in the middle of the night, my mind starts racing and sleep becomes impossible. So I just stayed in bed, scrolling through social media on my phone in the dark, watching videos of people showing off their Christmas presents, and texting a few friends who were also still awake. It is that typical holiday break behavior when you do not have school or any real responsibilities, and you just want to enjoy the late night freedom. But then, in the middle of the silence, I heard a very faint, muffled knock. I froze. I could not tell if the sound had come from my bedroom door, my window, or if my mind was just playing tricks on me because of all the weird events from the previous weeks. I sat up straight in my bed, staring into the darkness of my room with my heart pounding against my ribs. I was too terrified to move. I knew for a fact that absolutely nobody should be outside our house at 2 in the morning on Christmas night. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, so the idea of someone knocking on my window seemed almost impossible. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered enough courage to get out of bed and open my bedroom door. But just as I cracked it open, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. My brain instantly tried to rationalize it. I thought it must be my dad coming up to bed after staying up late to play his games. I stepped out onto the landing, fully intending to tell him that I was still awake, but as I reached the top of the stairs, I realized with absolute horror that it was not my dad. Standing on the stairs was a complete stranger, a man I had never seen before in my entire life. I felt a wave of pure sickness wash over me. I wondered if this was the person who had been knocking on our door all those weeks, and now he was already inside our home. He was staggering and swaying as he climbed the steps, looking heavily intoxicated. I slowly backed away into my bedroom, desperately praying he would not notice me. Fortunately, he was too disoriented to look up, and I managed to quietly shut my door. I stood there, listening intently as his footsteps shuffled around the landing. I could hear him opening doors, walking into one room after another. I realized with sheer panic that it was only a matter of time before he reached my door. I was completely frozen. All my logic and sense seemed to vanish in that moment of pure terror. After a few moments, I gently cracked my door open again to see where he was. I saw him stumbling out of my younger sister's bedroom. Seeing him near my sister's room finally snapped my brain back into action. I slipped out of my room, ran straight to my parents' bedroom, and shook them awake, whispering frantically that there was an intruder inside the house. My mom woke up instantly, but my dad was still groggy and confused. We all crept downstairs together to see what was happening. When we reached the living room, we were shocked to find the man completely passed out on our couch. He had found my dad's beer bottles, opened several of them, and scattered them all over the floor around him. My mom immediately lost her temper and began shouting at him to get out of our house. The man stirred slightly, opened his eyes, and angrily started insisting that this was his house and that we were the ones who needed to leave. We tried to pull him up, but his body was completely limp, like dead weight. My mom even slapped him across the face to try and wake him up, but he barely reacted. Just then, my dad came fully down the stairs, saw the situation, and immediately took charge. He roared at the man, telling him in no uncertain terms that he did not live here, and that he had to get out immediately. The man stubbornly refused. Seeing no other option, my dad physically grabbed the man, lifted him off the couch, and dragged him toward the side door of the house. He shoved him out into the cold night, and warned him never to show his face here again, before slamming the door shut and locking it. We all stood there, breathing heavily, thinking the nightmare was finally over. But just seconds later, a violent crash shattered the silence. The man had swung his fist and punched directly through the glass window next to the door. Shards of broken glass flew everywhere, scattering across the floor. Then, he pushed his bleeding face right through the broken pane, staring at us with wild eyes, looking exactly like that famous scene from the movie The Shining. While my dad ran to grab the phone to call the police, the man began screaming terrifying threats at us. He kept shouting that he owned the house now, that he knew exactly what all of our faces looked like, and that he was going to come back to get us. We were all in a state of absolute shock and terror. It was hard to process that something so violent and bizarre was happening to us on Christmas night. After a few minutes of screaming, the man finally stumbled away into the darkness. Shortly after, the police arrived at our house and began taking detailed statements from all of us. Since I was the one who had spotted him on the stairs first, my statement took the longest. Fortunately, because it was the middle of winter, it had actually snowed that night. In our part of Scotland, we usually just get wet slush, so having actual fresh snow on the ground was quite rare. And that snow turned out to be the key to finding him. There was a very clear, bright trail of red blood leading right down our street. The police officers followed the bloody tracks easily, and they led them straight to a nearby neighborhood playground. There, lying on the ground in the snow, they found the man. His hands were covered in cuts and embedded with shards of broken glass. They arrested him on the spot and confirmed to us that they believed he was the intruder. The very next morning, we had our broken window replaced. We sat down and explained everything to my younger siblings, who had miraculously slept through the entire chaotic ordeal, probably because they were completely exhausted from all the Christmas excitement and food. Because of my age and the terrifying threats the man had made toward us, I was granted a formal restraining order against him. He was eventually fined for the property damage and sentenced to community service instead of jail time. During his police interrogation, the detectives questioned him about the weeks of mysterious knocking that had occurred before his break-in, but the man swore he knew absolutely nothing about that. He denied ever coming near our house before that night. It turned out that he actually used to live in our house many years before my family had moved in. He claimed that he had no bad intentions whatsoever, saying he had simply had far too much to drink while out celebrating with his friends and had accidentally walked into his old home by mistake. We were incredibly grateful that nobody in our family was seriously injured. The only actual injury was a bruised wrist that my mom got from slapping him while wearing heavy metal bracelets. It turns out that slapping someone while wearing jewelry hurts you a lot more than it hurts them. But to this day, we have never found any explanation for the strange knocking sounds that plagued our house in the weeks leading up to that night. Even now, all these years later, I sometimes think I hear a faint knock at the door late at night. Sometimes I wonder if it is just my imagination playing tricks on me, or if there really was someone else out there in the dark, watching our house and waiting for the right moment. I suppose I will never truly know the answer. Our next story takes us back to around the year 2010, when I was just a young child of about 6 years old. My family was living in a quiet, cozy neighborhood in the city of Springfield, Oregon. Our household consisted of my mother, my older brother, my older sister, and myself. My dad was not with us at the time because he was deployed overseas with the military. I was extremely close with my dad, and whenever he was away for long stretches of time, it was always very hard on me. One late evening, it was pouring rain outside. My mom went out onto the front porch to have a cigarette, and I decided to sit out there with her to watch the rain fall. Even though it was quite cold and damp, I really enjoyed just sitting there in the quiet, spending that peaceful time with my mother. But as we were watching the rain bounce off the pavement, we noticed something strange. A man was walking right down the middle of our street. What made him stand out immediately was that he was wearing a very bright, oversized yellow rain jacket. It was a striking sight because it was incredibly late at night. The rain was coming down in sheets, and there was absolutely nobody else out on the road. My mom and I both watched him closely. As he got closer to our house, he began to steer his path slightly toward our driveway. My mom immediately stood up, put her cigarette out, and grabbed my hand tightly. We stood there on the porch and watched as the man came to a complete stop right next to the garbage cans at the edge of our driveway. My mom turned around to quickly usher me inside the safety of the house, and that was when the man suddenly began to scream at us. I cannot remember the exact words he was yelling, but I will never forget the absolute terror I felt as my mom hurried me through the front door. The moment we were inside, my mom locked the door shut and immediately turned off all the lights in the house, plunging us in darkness. I was absolutely terrified. Being only 6 years old, I burst into tears. My mom quickly gathered my siblings and me, shushing us gently, and led us all into my parents' large king-sized bed. We all huddled together under the blankets, feeling incredibly anxious and worried about the strange man outside. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing else happened. There was no more yelling, no strange noises, and no signs of the man. Eventually, the warmth of the bed overcame our fear, and we all drifted off to sleep. But that night, I had a horrible, vivid nightmare that I can still picture perfectly to this day. In the dream, I saw a man wearing that same massive yellow rain jacket, standing right outside our bedroom window, peering in at us through the glass. I woke up from the nightmare in a state of pure panic, crying and shaking uncontrollably. I reached over and shook my sister awake, crying as I told her how scared I was. I have no idea what time it actually was. My sister got out of bed and walked me to the master bathroom that was attached directly to the bedroom. She shut the door behind us and sat with me, talking to me in quiet whispers to help calm me down without waking up our mom or brother. But while we were sitting there in the bathroom, a sudden violent noise shattered the quiet. It was a loud, aggressive banging on our front door. My sister gasped, threw the bathroom door open, and ran over to my mom's side of the bed, shaking her awake as fast as she could without saying a word. My brother woke up instantly from the loud noise too. I sat frozen on the bathroom floor, completely terrified, as my mom gestured for my brother and sister to quickly join me inside the bathroom. We all huddled together on the floor, crying and shaking with fear, while the heavy, rhythmic banging on the front door continued to echo through the dark house. My mom went out into the hallway, trying to find her old BlackBerry phone so she could call the police. But in her panic, she could not find it anywhere. That meant we had absolutely no way to call for help. We sat there in the dark bathroom, listening to the man outside. He was not just knocking anymore. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that we let him inside, all while slamming his fists against the door. It was the most helpless, terrifying night of my entire life. It was just my mom and her 3 young children, with no phone, and my dad was thousands of miles away. We huddled close on the bathroom floor, crying and praying that one of our neighbors would hear the commotion and call the police. But nobody did. Eventually, the screaming and banging faded away, and the man left. No police ever showed up. What was so bizarre to us was that our neighborhood was quite small, with the houses built very close together. Our house was actually a duplex, sharing a wall with another family. How not a single neighbor managed to hear a grown man screaming and slamming on a door in the middle of the night was completely beyond us. Eventually, we managed to get back to sleep, and for a few weeks, everything seemed to return to normal, but the peace did not last long. Not even a month later, while it was still just the 5 of us in the house, my family woke up one morning to a chilling sight. Our front door was standing wide open. Not only that, but one of our windows was pushed open, and there was a giant, clean hole cut directly through the window screen. My mom immediately grabbed her phone and called the police. As we went through the house, we realized that several random items were missing. My piggy bank, which contained all of my holiday savings, was gone. Other random household items had been taken as well, but by far the most disturbing thing that was stolen was a large glass vase. For months, our family had been filling this vase with spare cash and coins, saving up for a special occasion, and the absolute most sickening part of it all was where that vase had been sitting. It had been placed right on my nightstand, directly next to the bed where my sister and I had been sleeping soundly all night. The thought that an intruder had stood right next to our sleeping bodies in the dark was absolutely horrifying. Because this happened so long ago, and because my mother has sadly passed away since then, many of the details of the police investigation have been lost to time. My dad was not there when the actual break-in occurred, so he could not fill in the blanks either. We never found out for sure if the intruder was ever officially caught by the authorities. I also still do not know to this day if the aggressive man in the yellow rain jacket was the same person who broke into our home weeks later. It could have been connected, or it could have been a completely different criminal. But there was one strange detail that we noticed later on. A few weeks after the burglary, I happened to look over at the porch of one of our neighbors. He was a quiet man who lived completely alone, and we rarely ever saw him leave his house. But sitting right there on his front porch was a large glass vase that looked identical to the one that had been stolen from my nightstand. We never got proof, and we never knew for sure, but the sight of it always left a lingering, unsettling feeling in my chest. This final story took place about 3 years ago, while I was living in Idaho serving a full-time religious mission. The small town where my companion, whom I will call Spencer, and I were assigned was incredibly small and remote. Because of how quiet the area was, there was not always a lot of work for us to do. To make matters worse, I was going through a really difficult personal patch at the time, struggling with low self-esteem and sleep issues. As a result of all this stress, Spencer and I found it really hard to stay out working all day long, so we spent a lot of time resting at home. We were renting a very tiny house, which was our only real option because there were simply no apartment buildings nearby. The layout of our tiny home was extremely simple. When you walked through the front door, you immediately stepped into the main living room where our desks were set up. To your immediate right was our bedroom door. If you kept walking straight, you would pass through a wide open doorway leading directly into the kitchen. Once you were in the kitchen, the bathroom was on your right, and the laundry room was on your left. It is also important to note that our landlord's house was located right next door, only a short distance away. If we ever ran into any issues, we could easily walk over or give him a quick phone call. On the night this happened, it had gotten dark quite early. Spencer and I were relaxing before going to bed. I was sitting at my desk in the living room, looking at my phone, while Spencer was sitting on his bed in the other room. In the middle of the quiet evening, I suddenly heard a single, distinct knock. It came from the kitchen window right above the sink. Because of our house layout, anyone standing at that kitchen window would have a clear view of the entire living area where I was sitting. I looked up immediately, but all I could see was the pitch black night. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it must have just been a tree branch brushing against the glass. But the more I thought about it, the more unlikely that seemed. None of the tree branches were close enough to touch the window. Just as I was having this thought, another knock sounded. This time, it came from the window in the laundry room around the corner. A heavy feeling of dread settled in my stomach. I called out to Spencer to tell him what I was hearing, but as the words left my mouth, a third knock sounded. It came from the living room window, directly next to where I was sitting. I did not look to see who was on the other side. I bolted from my chair, ran into the bedroom, and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I asked Spencer if he had heard it too, and his wide eyes told me everything. He had. We began to whisper frantically, debating what we should do. The only potential weapons we had in the entire house were a couple of small kitchen knives, and we had no idea how many people were outside, or if they were carrying weapons. Going outside to confront them was completely out of the question. As we were trying to decide on a plan, the knocking sound moved once again. This time it came from the front door itself. The knocks were steady and deliberate, and we were getting more and more terrified by the second. We talked about calling the police, but we were so far out in the middle of nowhere that we knew it would take a very long time for them to reach us. That was when Spencer remembered we had our landlord's phone number. He quickly dialed the number and began explaining the emergency. By this point, the knocking at the front door had stopped, but I knew what was coming next, and I was absolutely dreading it. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the knocks came directly against our bedroom window. Spencer told the landlord what was happening, and the landlord told us to stay exactly where we were. He said he was grabbing his shotgun and would be right over. We waited in total silence for several minutes, holding our breath, but nothing happened. Finally, we heard our landlord's voice calling out to us from the front door. We unlocked the bedroom door and let him in. He told us that as he was walking over, he saw a pickup truck suddenly speed away down the dark road. He said it was already too far away in the dark for him to see any details. Spencer and I grabbed our flashlights, and together with our landlord, we went outside to inspect the property. There were still a few small patches of snow left on the ground from a winter storm. In those patches of snow, we found a clear set of footprints circling the entire house, going from window to window. As far as we could tell, there was only one set of tracks. We debated calling the police to report it, but we knew they would have a hard time finding a random truck with no license plate. Our landlord told us to call him immediately if the truck returned, and then he went back to his house. We locked every lock, turned off the lights, and tried to get some sleep, but neither of us could close our eyes. We wondered if it could have been other missionaries playing a mean prank on us, but if it was, they never revealed themselves or said anything afterward. Plus, it was way past our strict curfew. We also wondered if it was local teenagers, but a prank like that is usually done in a group, and we had only found one single set of footprints. We asked around the community over the next few weeks, but nobody ever confessed to doing it. To this day, I still have no idea who was outside our house that night, or why they chose to target us, but the absolute scariest part of the entire experience was realizing that when the very first knock happened at the kitchen window, I had looked directly at that window. That means I was likely staring right into the eyes of the stalker in the dark, and I did not even realize it. From that night on, my sleeping issues only grew much worse, and my personal struggles did not improve. I ended up leaving the area eventually, and I know for a fact that I will never set foot near that tiny house again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine driving down a dark, empty highway in the middle of the night, thinking you are completely safe inside your own car, only to realize that a dangerous stranger is already sitting right behind you. It was early June of 2017 when a father decided to take a road trip with his 9-year-old son, Tom, to West Virginia to visit some family. It was a long and stressful drive. To make matters worse, their car did not have working air conditioning, and it was an incredibly hot summer day. By the time they hit the 6-hour mark, both of them were hot, tired, and deeply irritated. They had started their trip later in the afternoon, meaning they were still on the highway long after dark. Around 9, 0 p.m., while still on the interstate, Tom started complaining that he urgently needed to use the bathroom. There was already an incredibly heavy amount of tension in the car, because they had been arguing about some personal family matters that the father preferred not to share with the internet. This constant complaining brought about another tense exchange between them, and they decided to just stop talking altogether. At last, the father saw a blue rest area sign zoom past them on the side of the interstate, so he veered off. The rest area was highly isolated. It had a small building with 2 bathrooms, a couple of vending machines, and a few concrete benches. There were no other cars parked nearby, except for a large white pickup truck sitting quietly near the back. As the father pulled up next to the building, Tom got out in a hurry and ran straight inside. The father left the engine running because he knew his son would be back soon. Like he said, he did not want to get into the personal details of their argument, but they were at that silent stage where they were no longer exchanging words. He figured the rest of the long ride would be completely silent. About a minute later, he heard the rear passenger door open and then slam shut. The father wanted to say something to his son, but he did not know what to say, so he stayed quiet, put the car in drive, and immediately pulled away. But as he merged back onto the highway, he noticed the white pickup truck from the rest area was also leaving and had pulled up right behind him. The father switched to the left lane, and the pickup truck did the exact same thing. The driver started flashing his high beams aggressively. The father switched to the right lane, thinking this was just an aggressive driver, but the truck followed him there too, still flashing his lights. The father pulled further into the right lane and started to slow down. The truck sped up in the middle lane, and when he caught up, he slowed down and lowered his window. The father did the same, and the man started yelling something, pointing at the car. At first glance, the man looked like an incredibly creepy and sketchy guy. The father could not hear a word he was saying over the wind, so the stranger pointed for him to pull over to the grass. The father told his son to keep calm, mentally preparing to floor the gas if the man tried anything dangerous. The pickup pulled up behind them on the grass, and the guy jumped out, running toward the car. The father put the car in drive, his heart racing, ready to speed off, but then the man screamed to wait. He reached the window and said that the person in the back was not his kid. The father was confused and asked what he meant. The man repeated that the person who got into his car was not his son. Suddenly, the back right door opened. The father spun around and saw a tall, fully grown man climbing out of his back seat. Before anyone could react, the stranger vanished into the dark woods. Panic set in as the father realized Tom was still at the rest area. He thanked the truck driver, drove back across the grass, and returned to the rest stop. The pickup driver followed him. They found Tom waiting outside the bathroom, completely confused. The father explained everything to him, and they thanked the pickup driver again. This terrifying event actually ended their silent argument, and they talked for the rest of the trip. Sometimes, the danger comes from someone you willingly let into your vehicle out of pity. Recently, a young man and his girlfriend took a road trip to California. The drive there was completely normal and uneventful, but the long drive back home was a completely different story. They left midday, meaning most of their 10-hour drive would be in the dark. They made 2 food stops, the first after 3 hours, and the second much later in the night. Around 12:30 a.m., they got off the freeway and went to a Wendy's. The boyfriend ate while driving, which his girlfriend hated, but he just wanted to get home. Shortly after getting back on the freeway, it started to rain. The girlfriend forced him to pull over to the shoulder because she did not want him eating and driving in poor conditions. As they pulled to the side, the rain turned into a massive downpour, pounding heavily on the car roof. As he finished his food, they suddenly heard a loud bang on the window. At first, he thought it was just debris from the storm, but when he looked to his left, he saw a dark figure blocking almost the entire window. His girlfriend let out a sharp, sudden shriek of absolute terror. He did not want to roll the window down because of the pouring rain, but he could not hear what the person was saying over the storm. He cracked the door open and yelled out. It was a woman, completely soaked, disheveled, and looking absolutely terrified. She desperately asked for a ride. The boyfriend could not bring himself to leave her stranded in those conditions, so he told her to get in the back seat. His girlfriend turned around and gave him an angry, questioning look, completely disapproving of his decision. He asked the woman where she was heading, but she did not answer. He saw his girlfriend give him another look. He turned around to look at the woman in the back, assuming she had not heard him over the noise of the rain. But when he looked, he felt a wave of unease. She was staring right at him with a cold, blank, and completely expressionless face. Something about her vacant stare was deeply off-putting. He repeated his question, but she just shrugged her shoulders and looked away. Feeling incredibly uncomfortable, the boyfriend announced out loud to both his girlfriend and the woman that he would be dropping her off at the very next town they crossed. He put the car in drive and merged back onto the empty, dark highway. For a brief moment, the car was quiet. Then, without warning, an ear-piercing scream came from the back seat. The woman lunged forward and wrapped her arms tightly around his throat, choking him. He struggled to breathe and slammed on the brakes, almost sliding into the highway divider. In a panic, his girlfriend turned around and began slashing at the woman's face with her long nails. The woman's deranged screaming turned into cries of agony as she let go. The boyfriend put the car in park, jumped out into the rain, opened the back door, and physically threw the woman out onto the wet road. She lay there, clutching her scratched face, crying and begging over and over, saying, "Please, please." He ignored her, got back inside, and locked all the doors. As he put the car in drive, she ran up and began frantically banging on the windows, screaming like an asylum patient. They drove away quickly. The girlfriend immediately called the police to warn them about the unstable woman, and they drove straight home without stopping, completely shaken. Sometimes, the road itself is a trap carefully set by people waiting in the shadows. Back in 2010, a man was driving his Ford F-150 pickup truck from Pennsylvania to Georgia to visit family in the countryside. It was a long 14-hour drive, and he decided to do it all in one day. He set out at 10 a.m., stopping once for lunch at a local deli and once at a rest area to eat some sandwiches. By around 11:30 p.m., he had just finished filling up his gas tank for the very last stretch of the trip, which gave him an estimated arrival time of 12:30 a.m. He was getting very tired, but did not think to buy coffee. The GPS took him off the main highway and routed him down some quiet countryside roads. His truck was lifted and had a bright light bar installed, which helped light up the pitch-black roads. Even though he was exhausted and knew he should not be driving, he was so close to his cousin's house that he kept going. He came to a stop sign and made a left turn onto an even quieter road. The speed limit was 45, but since the road was empty and surrounded by dense woods, he was going around 55 to 60 miles per hour. Suddenly, his lights caught the reflection of 4 shiny objects in the road ahead. He slammed on the brakes, his truck coming to a stop just before hitting them. They were large orange traffic drums blocking the lane. Confused and deeply concerned, the driver grabbed a heavy baseball bat from behind his seat and cautiously stepped out of his truck to investigate. As he walked up to the drums, he realized there was something much more dangerous hidden behind them. Laid out on the asphalt was a heavy-duty spike strip, the exact kind used by police to stop vehicles. The driver froze, realizing there were no police officers or signs of construction. This was a trap. He began cautiously backing up toward his truck, looking around. Suddenly, a voice screamed for help from the woods on his left. He refused to go into the dark forest and called out to ask what was wrong, but there was no answer. He walked to the edge of the road, and using the bright light from his truck, he spotted someone crouched down behind some bushes watching him. Trying not to show his fear, he casually walked back to his truck and got inside. As he closed the door, he saw 2 dark silhouettes emerge from the woods, walking toward his vehicle. The driver quickly put the truck in drive, steered onto the dirt shoulder, and drove around the spike trap. As he sped away, he looked in his mirror and saw at least 3 figures standing near the drums in the red glow of his taillights. He made it out safely, but he never forgot how close he came to a deadly ambush. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Our first story begins with a father who wanted to do something incredibly special for his son. His son was about to turn 18 years old, which is a major milestone. the father decided that the perfect gift would be a reliable used car. So, he started searching all the typical car websites like Cars.com and eBay Motors. But the problem was, everything he found was severely overpriced. He was on a budget, and the current car market was just not cooperating. After a week of frustrating searches, he decided to look on Craigslist. It was the only place left where he thought he might find an actual deal. And then, about a week into his search, he hit what looked like the jackpot. He found a listing for a 2003 Toyota Camry. The car only had 67,000 miles on it. It had never been in any accidents, had absolutely no damage, and was in great condition. The best part was the price. The seller was only asking for $3,500. For a car known to be as reliable as a Camry, especially with such low mileage, this was an absolute steal. To make things even better, the seller lived only about 10 miles away. It was a very reasonable drive. The father immediately grabbed his phone and gave the seller a call to set up a time to check out the vehicle. The man who answered the phone sounded completely normal. He was polite and friendly. He assured the father that there were absolutely no mechanical problems with the car. He introduced himself simply as Bob. The father felt reassured by the call. He went ahead and gathered $3,500 in cash. Even though he planned on trying to negotiate the price down as much as possible, he wanted to have the full amount ready just in case. He drove up a long, dusty dirt road to Bob's property. He arrived about 15 minutes early. As he looked around, he noticed the property was quite isolated. There was a tiny older house sitting on a decent-sized plot of land, mostly because it was located pretty far from any of the nearest neighbors. He looked over at the garage, which was wide open. He hoped to see the Camry parked inside, but the garage was completely empty, except for an unusually large amount of random car parts scattered all over the place. The Camry itself was nowhere to be seen. In fact, the only vehicle on the entire property was an old, beaten-up pickup truck. The father got out of his car and walked over to the front door of the house to verify the address. He looked at the house numbers, and indeed, it was the exact address Bob had given him. He went to press the doorbell, but the button was completely missing. So he knocked on the wooden front door instead. He stood there waiting in the quiet afternoon air. He knocked every once in a while for exactly 5 minutes, but nobody came to the door. At this point, he was getting extremely confused. He decided to dial Bob's phone number to see if he was running late. As soon as the call started ringing on his end, he heard the distinct sound of Bob's phone ringing from deep inside the house. Now he knew for a fact that Bob was home, or at least that his phone was inside. He could not understand why Bob was not answering the door or his phone. He decided he needed to take a peek through one of the front windows to see if anyone was moving around inside. He walked over to the window and cupped his hands around his eyes, peering through the dusty glass. It was incredibly dark inside the house, so it was hard to make out many details. He could see an old-fashioned dining room set sitting in the shadows. But then, across from the dining room, his eyes adjusted, and he saw something that made him freeze. There was a figure standing perfectly still by the back door of the house. The person was just staring outside, facing away from the front of the house. The father figured this had to be Bob, and that maybe Bob was hard of hearing. He knocked loudly on the window glass to get his attention, but the figure did not even flinch. It did not move a single inch. There was no fence blocking the way to the backyard, so the father decided to just walk around the side of the house. He wanted to meet the man and figure out what was going on. He could not comprehend how someone could fail to hear him knocking on both the door and the window. But when he finally stepped into the backyard and walked up to the glass of the back door, he made a shocking and horrifying realization. The figure standing by the door was not a living man who was ignoring him. It was a taxidermied human being. It was a real human body, preserved and mounted, standing there like a statue. Panic immediately set in. The father turned around and ran as fast as he could back the way he came. He sprinted to his car, threw open the door, and hopped inside. Just before he put the car in reverse and hit the gas, he looked up at the window he had peered into just minutes earlier. The blinds, which had been open, were now shut, but he could clearly see that 2 of the blinds had been creased open. Someone was standing right there, watching him drive away. He put his foot all the way to the floor and did not slow down until he was safely back at his own home. When he sat down to process what had just happened, everything began to feel incredibly sinister. There was no Camry. There were only piles of car parts, an empty garage, a taxidermied human body, and someone hiding in the dark watching him. It became completely and painfully clear that whoever Bob was, he had no intention of selling a car that day. The father realized with a terrifying shiver that if he had stayed any longer, he might have ended up as a lifeless statue staring out of that man's back door. Our next story takes us back to when the narrator was just a little kid. At the time, they lived alone with their single mother, who worked incredibly hard to take care of them. Because she worked so much, the child was often left home alone, or spent a lot of quiet nights in bed. But their mother was incredibly loving and made it a strict routine to always check on her child every single night. Whenever she would get up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, she would quietly slide the bedroom door open, peek in, and make sure everything was okay. It was a comforting habit that always made the child feel safe and secure, no matter how dark the house got. But one night in particular stands out from all the rest, and it is a memory that still brings chills. The child woke up in the middle of the night to a strange, soft rustling sound. They opened their eyes, feeling a bit disoriented in the dark room. They looked toward the closet, thinking they had heard something moving inside of it. But as they looked up toward the foot of their bed, they saw a familiar figure standing in the shadows. It looked exactly like their mother, standing right there in the dim light of the bedroom. She looked at the child and gave a warm, playful wave. She whispered softly, telling the child to go back to sleep. The child felt an immediate sense of relief seeing their mom, thinking she was just checking in like she always did. The mother then turned, walked over to the closet, and pulled the closet door until it was just barely open. She stepped inside the closet, leaving just a tiny crack between the door and the frame. The child watched as she stood inside the dark closet, poking her head through the crack of the barely opened door. The child remembered vividly seeing her single eye peeking through the darkness, staring directly at them. It was a bit strange, but being a young, naive kid, they did not think too much of it. They assumed their mother was just playing a silly game with them before she went back to her own room. Within moments, the child closed their eyes and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, the child was sitting at the kitchen table, eating a bowl of cereal. Their mother was standing by the counter, preparing breakfast, and the child casually asked her why she had been hiding in the closet and peeking at them the night before. As soon as the words left the child's mouth, the mother completely stopped what she was doing. She turned around slowly, a look of deep puzzle and intense concern spreading across her face. She looked at her child and spoke very seriously. She explained that she had not been in the bedroom at all last night. In fact, she had slept straight through the night and had never even gotten up to use the bathroom. At first, the mother was absolutely terrified that someone had broken into their home while they slept. She searched the entire house, checking the locks and the windows, but found no signs of forced entry. Eventually, because there was no evidence of an intruder, she assumed that her child must have experienced a highly vivid dream or some kind of sleep hallucination. Over the years, the narrator only had 2 other hallucinations in their life, but neither of them was ever as vivid or as deeply creepy as the figure of their mother waving from the foot of the bed and hiding in the closet. To this day, they still wonder if it really was just a dream, or if a complete stranger had actually been standing in their room that night, pretending to be their mother. Fast forward to the year 2009. The narrator was spending a weekend with their uncle on his remote ranch. This was because their parents were busy renovating the new house they had just bought, and they wanted the kids out of the dusty construction zone. It was the second night of the stay, which happened to be a Saturday. That night, one of the biggest thunderstorms of the entire year rolled over the area. The storm was incredibly intense. There were at least 3 massive crashes of thunder and lightning every single minute. The ranch was right in the heart of the storm, which meant the thunder would crash almost instantly after the lightning lit up the sky. Now, the narrator actually enjoyed the sound of storms. They found it relaxing to listen to the rain and thunder while laying in bed. So, they decided to stay up a little later than usual, watching a movie on the television and just enjoying the dark, cozy ambiance of the guest bedroom. Eventually, the movie ended and the screen went black, The narrator turned off the TV, rolled over, and tried to drift off to sleep. Just as a bright flash of lightning illuminated the room, they heard a strange sound. It was a very distinct, metallic thud coming from somewhere outside the house. It happened at the exact same moment as the thunder. At first, they did not pay much attention to it, assuming it was just a loose piece of metal on the ranch reacting to the wind. But then, about 20 seconds later, it happened again. Another loud metallic thud, timed perfectly with the next lightning strike. The problem was, the narrator's uncle was a very quiet, somewhat eccentric and creepy guy. The narrator had never been close with him at all. Because of this distant relationship, they did not feel comfortable getting out of bed to go wake him up over a weird noise. They did not want to seem dramatic or cause a scene. So, they just lay there, trying to ignore it, but the noise kept happening. Every time the lightning flashed, the metallic thud would follow. It was getting closer and louder. What on earth could be making that sound? After the third consecutive thud, the narrator could not take the suspense anymore. They quietly slipped out of bed and walked over to the guest bedroom window. The heavy rain was pouring down the glass, making it extremely difficult to see anything out in the dark, open fields. Suddenly, a massive flash of lightning lit up the entire property. The narrator scanned the yard, but saw nothing out in the open. However, at that exact moment, the metallic thud echoed again, and this time, it sounded like it was coming from the immediate left of the window, right in a blind spot. The narrator knew their uncle would be mad if they messed around with the window. But they had to know what was out there. They carefully unhooked the window lock and slid the glass upward. Immediately, the cold wind blew drops of rain directly onto their face. They leaned their head out of the open window and looked to the left. At that exact millisecond, another flash of lightning brightened the sky. And there, crouched down by the outside basement door, was a person dressed entirely in black. The person had their hand raised high in the air, holding a heavy metal object. Before the sky plunged back into total darkness, the narrator saw exactly what the person was doing. They were repeatedly bashing the metal tool against the heavy lock of the basement door. The narrator pulled their head back inside, quietly shut the window, and locked it. They were in an absolute panic, terrified that the intruder might have heard or seen them open the window. They ran back to the bed, jumped under the covers, and pretended to be fast asleep, keeping their back turned to the window. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, but this time there was no metallic thud. The silence was deafening. The narrator's heart dropped into their stomach as they realized the person had stopped. Had they been spotted? They lay perfectly still in the dark, frozen with fear, hoping the person would just walk away. After a few more minutes passed with lightning, but no more thuds, they decided it was finally safe to run and get their uncle. They turned their head to face the window so they could get out of bed. But as soon as they looked, they let out a blood-curdling scream. There, clear as day in the flash of the storm, was a dark figure standing right outside the window, pressing their face against the glass, staring directly in at them. The narrator screamed at the top of their lungs and sprinted down the hallway to their uncle's bedroom. The uncle, waking up to the screams, immediately grabbed his hunting rifle. Wearing nothing but his pajamas and bare feet, he ran out into the pouring rain like a madman, screaming into the darkness. He searched the entire property, but the intruder had already vanished into the night. The next morning they went down to examine the basement door. They could see deep, heavy marks bashed into the metal lock. It was incredibly close to giving way. According to the uncle, 3 or 4 more hard hits would have broken the lock completely. The narrator left the ranch that very day, incredibly grateful that they had stayed up late. Our fourth story takes place in the year 2017. The narrator of this story admits that they actually enjoy going to the movie theaters completely alone. On a stormy Wednesday evening, they decided to drive to the local theater. They went to see a relatively low-key movie. When they walked into the auditorium, they were pleased to find that they were the only person in the entire theater. They walked up to the higher rows, picked a seat right in the center, and sat down. About 20 minutes into the film, they noticed something out of the corner of their eye. A few rows down and to the side, they noticed a shape. Someone was sitting there, but this person was not sitting in their seat like a normal moviegoer. All the narrator could see was the top half of a head. peeking over the top of the headrest. The head was turned in a direction that was definitely not facing the movie screen. It was pointing directly toward the narrator. As the movie screen went dark again, the head slowly lowered down behind the seat, completely disappearing from view. The narrator was now extremely uncomfortable, but just as they were getting back into the plot of the movie, the head suddenly popped up again from behind a seat. This time, it was much closer, only about 3 rows away. The sudden appearance made the narrator jump out of their skin. With the head being so close now, they could see much more detail. The face looked completely dead. The eyes were wide open, motionless, and totally glassy. It was a man with long, unkempt hair. The narrator had reached their limit and decided to get the heck out of there. They grabbed their things and scrambled down the row toward the exit. But to get to the exit door, they had to walk right past the row where the creepy person was hiding. As they stepped past the row, they glanced down and saw something straight out of a horrific nightmare. There was a man lying flat on his back on the theater floor, holding up a long wooden stick. Perched on the very top of that stick was a severed human head. The narrator did not wait to find out if it was a sick joke or if the head was real. They bolted through the exit door, ran out of the building to the parking lot, and drove home in a total panic. Once they were safe, they researched recent missing persons reports. They found a photograph of a 17-year-old boy named Donald Watkins, who had vanished a month prior. Looking closely at the photo, the features matched the head in the theater perfectly. The next day, the narrator called the movie theater and suggested they check their security cameras. The narrator left their phone number but never received a call back. Our 5th story takes us to Northville, Michigan, where a guy lived in a small rental house with his longtime friend Ben. Directly across the street was an abandoned, overgrown house with graffiti next to the front window. Their neighbor, Marv, was a strange older guy with a long gray beard who told them the place had been empty forever. One evening, while sitting on their front stoop, the narrator saw a face staring at them through the lone upstairs window of the abandoned house. When they ran to tell Marv, he refused to answer his door despite being visible inside. Ben owned a katana, and they decided to go across the street to investigate. They broke in through the backyard and searched the dusty, empty first floor. As they approached the stairs, Ben screamed out, asking if anyone was up there. Suddenly, they heard the loud, rapid sound of heavy stomping running across the ceiling directly toward the top of the stairs. They panicked and ran out of the house. As they caught their breath, they saw Marv standing at his window, staring intently at them. They packed up and moved out the very next day. Our final story takes place in rural New Jersey, where a father hosted an outdoor birthday party for his son. The backyard was bordered by thick woods. Late that evening, the father went to the shed to grab some tiki torches and heard heavy footsteps in the leaves nearby, but saw nothing. Later, the kids went to play hide and seek in the trees. Within 15 minutes, their happy shouts turned into terrified screams as they ran out, crying that something was in the woods. The father and his brother Dom went to investigate with flashlights. They felt watched, and then heard a bizarre, angry moaning sound. They shone their lights and saw a figure behind a tree. Suddenly, a blood-curdling, inhuman scream filled the air. They ran back and called the sheriff, who blamed a wild animal. But the brothers knew they had seen a 2-legged figure. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you are 18 years old, starting your college journey is supposed to be one of the most exciting and memorable times of your entire life. It is a time for making new friends, going to parties, and discovering who you are. But for one young man, things did not exactly go according to plan. He did not get the chance to go away to a big traditional university or a major party school where socializing and meeting new people is practically handed to you on a silver platter. Instead, he ended up attending a local commuter college. Because of this, his friend group shrunken tremendously during his freshman year. He found himself feeling bored and pretty lonely. It was a frustrating cycle that many people in commuter schools have to deal with. So, like many other teenagers in his position, he turned to social media and dating apps to meet girls. He spent a lot of time on Tinder, Bumble, and Instagram, just hoping to find a connection. One afternoon, he was browsing through his phone when he saw a new notification on Instagram. It was a follow request from an attractive girl named Miranda. He could tell she was attractive just based off her main profile picture. He requested to follow her back, she instantly accepted, and he checked her pictures to make sure it was not a catfish. Her profile seemed real. She had around 4,500 followers, she only followed a few hundred people, and all her pictures had a lot of likes and comments. And then she direct messaged him, and his face lit up. She messaged him saying she found him on Tinder and thought he was cute. He was so excited that he actually double-checked his own profile to make sure he looked his best. Yes, he had his Instagram username in his Tinder bio at the time. She also had photos posted dated back to beyond a year prior, so everything checked out on his catfish radar. They chatted in the direct messages for a few days. When she posted a new picture, he liked it and commented on it as she asked him to. He just put down a couple of fire emojis. She liked it, of course. He checked some of the other comments. They were also from guys hyping her up, throwing her compliments left and right. Clearly he was not the only guy talking to her. Well, one night they struck up a conversation once again, still in the direct messages. He told her he had the house to himself that night, and figured he would be risky and invite her over. She seemed pretty open to it. He just tried his best to keep it as lighthearted as possible. He gave her his address just to ask her how long of a drive it would be. She said 10 minutes. She quickly replied, "Yeah, I will come over." Then she asked him how old he was, and he said 18. She replied that she was 19, but this conflicted with something that he remembered. He recalled she replied to one of the many other men commenting on one of her posts. His comment was something like, "Damn girl, how old are you?" And she replied 25. The guy she was responding to was some bald guy who looked to be in his 50s. This got him suspicious. He started analyzing the people who were commenting on her posts a little more, and he realized they were all guys. There were no female friends commenting. Most comments were from older men. There were some pictures of her with other girls, but none of them were tagged, and there were no comments from them. He wondered if she was playing some kind of sick game, or if she was trying to lure him into a dangerous trap. This was starting to scream catfish, so he blocked the account. Not long after talking, within 10 minutes, he started getting spammed with direct messages from 3 random accounts. They all had profile pictures, but all of them had less than 50 followers. They all appeared to be fake, and they were sending him threats about how he should not have done that. He gave in and replied to one of them, and instantly it replied back, "Unblock Miranda." He blocked that account as well, and went to unsend all his recent direct messages to that Miranda account, specifically the one with his address in it. He counted himself lucky he did not give the account his phone number or any other info. He set his profile to private, gave up on having company, and went to bed. He has trouble sleeping 90% of the time, and this night was no exception. So after at least an hour and a half of trying to fall asleep, he heard noises from outside in the living room. Now this was in February, so it was freezing out and the heat was on full blast. So there were always ticking and clicking sounds from all the baseboard heaters, but a couple of noises sounded a little different, like louder. He did not go check though, and while each click and clack from around the house was making him look over into his dark room, making sure no one was there, he eventually somehow fell asleep. Every tiny creak of the wood made his chest tighten with fear, but not for long. He woke up and it was still dark in the room. He knew something woke him up. Like how sometimes you hear a sound in your sleep, and it is a delayed reaction before you wake up a few seconds later. Well, that is what happened here. He sat up in his bed, the clicking of the heater still filling the room. He looked in the far corner of his room, and at first he did not believe what he was seeing. He looked closer and could see it better. There was a person in the corner of the room, and he swore he could see their grinning face. He was so scared in that moment, he got up from his bed, unable to even scream. He ran all the way outside into the snow in his bare feet, and he rang the neighbor's bell a million times. While in there, he basically cried to them that someone was in the house, and he used their phone to call 911. When police searched the entire house, they did not find anyone. The back door and side door were both locked, and so were most of the windows. The only possibility of someone getting in would have been through one of the backyard windows, which was left unlocked. The police comforted him, saying it could be a waking hallucination. He spent the rest of the night in deep anxiety, never knowing if it was a dream or if the catfish was really in his bedroom. A few months after this incident, that account was either deleted by the user or taken down by Instagram. It no longer exists. Instagram is a favorite time-waster app for many people who spend a good chunk of their free time browsing it. Most of us have gotten our share of creepy direct messages, and we have learned to ignore them. So when a young student got a notification from Instagram that some random account requested to message her, she did not sweat it. She did, however, just open the message because she always does out of curiosity. The message was a link to another Instagram profile named Perfect Always, but spelled with a Z. She pressed the link and it opened